Much of what we learn about science, nature, and the environment happens outside of school and beyond the walls of museums, zoos, and nature centers. I have worked as an independent environmental professional for many years and know there are others like me who interact with the public in communities worldwide. On the Talaterra podcast, we discover who these professionals are, what they do, and how they create change. Why do I focus on independent professionals? I focus on them because they move freely through communities. They move freely between schools, organizations, businesses, programs, and other informal learning environments. They are positioned to meet the public where they are, and this is powerful. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tania Marien. Hi, it's Tania. Today, we get to learn from Diane Wyzga, story strategist, guide, and founder of the practice called Engaged Storyism. Diane is also the creator, host, and producer of Stories from Women Who Walk, a much-loved and listened-to podcast that has spread wisdom and touched hearts worldwide. I reached out to Diane so you and I could think about story. Not in an MBA marketing sort of way, but in a real way. A way that reflects who we are as individuals and professionals. What is your story, and how do you find it? Let's find out. Diane, thank you so much for stopping by the show today. I've been thinking a lot about environmental educators and community-based educators and how busy they are and all the things that they do. And what they do is more than just logistical stuff, planning the next workshop, looking for the next venue, buying supplies and that type of thing. There is so much more to them and who they are and so much more to their story. And when it comes to story and listening to what really moves people and what people's motivations are, I think of you because you have this magical ability to, as you say, borrowing your words, you have this magical ability to listen the story out of people. And that is so true. And I've seen it happen in person. I've experienced myself. And I really wanted to have a moment to chat with you to talk about how environmental educators can get to the heart of their own message so that they can then do what they intended to do, not just all the logistical work, and also tend to the people that they serve in a way that is meaningful for them and their audiences and purposeful. So thank you so much for stopping by today.
Well, that's a duffel bag full of good stuff. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm tickled to be here. We've known each other for several years now, and I've been very lucky to be following your work and your evolution as a podcaster, as someone who is an advocate for environmental educators working independently. So I believe that over time, I've learned at least as much from you and your way of being in the world and listening and coming up with really deep, thoughtful questions. Like when I explain you to my family, to my sisters, I say she's like a deep river. It's like she's flowing by and then you don't really know that the flow is going on because it's not a rapids. It's a deep flowing, easy river. But then you come up with this question that says, oh, she's flowing right along there. So thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have a chat about what we can do to help environmental educators working independently to get to the heart of their message.
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you, Diane. Okay.
You're welcome.
I've been thinking, as I said, I've been thinking a lot about how people are moving through their work and how things have changed for people. And I'm reading a lot about storytelling from a business perspective, right? I mean, that usually comes through business type publications, but that's not quite a fit. It's not quite the way I think interpreters, environmental educators, and community-based educators work. It's really much for business people. I think that interpreters of the environment and people in communities need something else. They have a different way of knowing, a different way of relating to their audiences. And so I was thinking that your way of seeing people's story and helping them reflect upon what their own stories are would be a really wonderful conversation and be really helpful to listeners. I guess here's what I'm looking for is a way to help listeners find a way forward and maybe to pause and reflect on where they are now and where they're going next. How might they be able to do that on their own?
Let's begin the experiment of exploration generally, and then move it to a specific. We've been talking about one's origin story and the importance of that. And I know we really want to get into that subject and hopefully give your listeners an opportunity to learn about it in a practical way so that they can begin to at least think about it. I also wanted to revisit the story that you told me when you were getting your summit ready about an opportunity to pivot in your world from a place where you didn't know how to spell plant to becoming, who you are, the environmental educator advocate that you are today. So I'm going to read this because I want to get it right. This is a quote by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he says that all truly wise thoughts have been thought already thousands of times. But to make them truly ours, we must think them over again honestly till they take root in our personal experience. And I think what he is saying there, at least when it comes to story, is that in order to make something truly ours, we have to engage with it. So to spare your listeners a rant about story and the business world, I will simply say that we've known story from the very beginning. Story is just the way we as humans communicate. It's what we understand. Some people say that we're wired to narrative. Well, maybe we are, maybe we aren't. But what I do know is that something told in a story is something that we can relate to. It's what connects us. It's what engages us. And so with business and story, I feel very strongly that business has co-opted and conscripted story for its own purposes and made it very flat, product-oriented, and driven to profit so that the idea becomes story sells. And I can tell you an anecdote to sell you my product, and I'll say it's a story, but you know better. You know that it's not. You know a shill when you hear a shill. So the purpose of engaging with a story is that when we do that, we are internalizing feelings, sensations, emotions, images, experiences. And what we internalize is what gets shared then when we share the story. So the words of a story will certainly convey images, but what the listener gets is much more. What they're relating to are the feelings, the sensations, the emotions, the memories that come up for them. You might have someone talking about an experience of a night in the woods, gone camping perhaps, backpacking, And the listener may never have had that opportunity before. Yet, the feelings of being surrounded by nature, by being in silence, by having a chance to slow down and look at what's around them might bring up memories or feelings or emotions that the listener has based on something else. And that's where the connection takes place. So when we are engaged in a story, we are deeply relating to the how and the where and the what of the story, not simply the words that are being exchanged. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And it is perfect because the interpreters who are listening to this, the environmental educators, the people who work in the field, who work with the public, story is their medium. Their words are their medium. And that's all they have, because whatever setting they are in, they don't have a whiteboard. They don't have a slide projector. They don't have, none of those types of devices they have. And their role is to create an emotional and intellectual connection with what's in front of them, the space that they are all sharing and that they are all experiencing.
Science communication is not just facts. Facts are important. That will oftentimes be the content of your story, but it also has to take place within a context. You can't have one without the other. If you just give someone facts or content, it will be like, I don't know, marshmallow, font, computer, stick. It makes no sense. It doesn't hang together. But when you give someone the context within which something happened, then it makes sense. So, for example, if I were to say to you, once upon a time, long ago and far away, there was a woodcutter and his wife, and they lived in a cottage in the woods, and one day they found a baby under a tree. Well, I didn't have to say anything about that for you to have a sense in your imagination about what the woodcutter and his wife looked like, where this cabin in the woods might have been, what it would be like to find a baby under a tree. And so part of the work of story is that we want to give people enough detail, concrete detail, so they have a sense of what it is that the content is all about, why it matters. But we also want to put it within a context so that they understand it. So that's really the purpose of, in this case, in science communication, shaping the story. You're doing that so that someone will hear it in the way it's intended to be heard. And by that, I mean, we want them to hear it in the way that it is to be understood, because we believe what we understand. And we understand messages that we hear in stories because it's a natural way of learning for us. So that when we begin to shape a story, we are integrating ourselves and the listener into a particular event. So if you can imagine three overlapping circles, kind of like, the Olympics, but not quite. So one circle is going to be the teller. One circle is going to be the listener. And the last circle is going to be the story. And where all three intersect right in the middle, that's where the organic power of the story is happening, because you need all three things to make that story come alive. If it's just me talking, that could be a monologue. If it's you and me talking together, you and I talking together, that's a dialogue. But once we start to invite story into the process, then it becomes this organic, living thing that is more than the elements. And so having an understanding of what it is we want to convey, how come we want to convey it, what we want our listener to enjoy in the process, because a story is always done in service to the listener, then we have a beginning of how come we want to share a particular story with someone and how we might go about deciding what that story is and how we will begin to shape it.
Okay, so of those three circles, the storyteller, I think, or my thinking is at the moment, the storyteller doesn't get as much attention, personal attention, as the other elements do. Because there's planning, there's all the planning and the research and this, that, and the other, and the learning that needs to happen before you can weave a story together. Those are all external tasks. But the storyteller brings themselves there. They are motivated to be there for, whatever reason, whatever their reasons are. How can we focus on the storyteller and help them reflect on what their story is and why they are doing what they are doing? How can we give them more attention?
Okay, so let's do this because I so love this story. I just know everybody else is going to also. But if you can remember back when you were telling me the story about what first ignited your interest in environmental world large. And if I remember it correctly, it was a teacher in high school, a gentleman who was in a wheelchair. And there was something about the relationship that you as a student had with this person who was your teacher that set you off in a particular path. Do you remember that story? Would you share that with us as you remember it?
Sure. It was Mr. Kennedy, the physiology teacher in high school. He was he was kind, interesting. I mean, he told really good stories, and it really got me excited about physiology. And that was going to be my focus going into college as a biology major. Okay. And about at the same time, I had the general bio class in high school, and there was a plant project, and there was, this other stuff, which didn't appeal to me at all. I thought it was a hassle. And so plants, why? And so, but anyway, I wanted to be like Mr. Kennedy. I wanted to work in a lab. I wanted to know what he knew. I wanted to be able to explain things as well as he did, and I just wanted to be like him. And so I went into college as a biology major, and then things changed. The biology teacher in college, who I still have contact with today, introduced me to the world of organismal biology. So it was plants and animals and all sorts of other things, but it was different. He is also a very good storyteller and makes all sorts of information understandable and wove all these diverse topics together so that it all made sense. And that just set me on the path that I am now. That, and also working in that zoology lab. And, part of my responsibilities was to do classroom visits and to tell stories to the kids about the reptiles and the amphibians and all this that I had with me, to introduce them to nature and the outdoors. And it wasn't until 3 years ago that it dawned on me that was the beginning of where I am now, right? That started then. It took decades for me to realize that was truly the origin of everything that I did after that.
See, every time I hear this story, I still love it. I love it even more. What was it that you remember about Mr. Kennedy and the other professor? What was it that you remember about the stories that has you say they told wonderful stories?
They were always conversations. It wasn't a transfer of information. It was a conversation. It was them really like sitting next next to you or sitting down with you and chatting. It was chatting. But even in the lecture, in the classroom format, when they were relaying information, it wasn't like that. It just had context to it, I guess, is a word I would use. It just had context. It just made sense, and it made lights go on and connections appear and that's all. I don't know how else to describe it, because that's it. I mean, and these are people who I can listen to all the time, sit next to and chat with all the time. There wasn't a hierarchy. It was always a conversation, and both of them, in their own ways and in their respective topics that they covered, made me want to turn around and make all that information digestible for somebody else. And that is what made them, I think, so effective, and really what really has informed everything, I think, or a lot of what I have done ever since.
So you bring up something. It sounds like both of these gentlemen were what you might call natural-born storytellers. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that people are saying, well, I don't know how to do that. I'm not a natural-born storyteller. I don't know how to tell stories. And to that, I say, bunk. I remember, decades ago, being in a conference and someone said, how do you become a storyteller? You tell stories. And how do you become a better storyteller? You tell more stories. And so each of us has a certain level of ability, for lack of a better word. But there isn't a person on earth who can't tell a story. You might need a little bit more practice than some people, but I think we have a natural talent to converse with each other in the form of a story. We're always doing it. What happened to you over the weekend? Where'd you go on your summer vacation? Blah, blah, blah. It's a constant sharing of narrative, and we do it by way of metaphor. We're always talking about how this is like that. So to someone who says, I don't know how to do that, I'm just going to say, put that aside right now, because that's a limiting belief. That's not going to help you get ahead and tell stories to people. So we begin with something that we know how to do, and that is, how do we tell a story that is about us, but do it in a way that, as you said, is conversational. So it doesn't feel like it's a monologue. And if someone is self-conscious about using their voice by putting themselves into a story, that tends to minimize that feeling of self-consciousness. They might be talking about themselves, but not in the same way as if they were saying, well, I. So something about the way in which both men were communicating was making use of the structure of story that is common to all of our human experiences. Something in the way they were conversing with the class probably had a bit of a hero's journey in it. This is where I was. This is what I was called out to do. This is what I accepted as the challenge. This is who I met along the way. These are the people that helped me. These are the people that tried to keep me back. And yet I managed to prevail. And as I continued down the road, there were other hurdles and challenges and tasks and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I prevailed. And so whether they're telling that story about themselves, or whether they're telling that story about someone who was influential in the science world, or whether they were telling that story about, nature itself, this is a structure that is so common to our human experience that we gravitate to it. We go, I know that story. And that's why every single movie that we see out there, Harry Potter and The Hobbit, and you name it, it's all the same. It's all the same story about how we were just living our lives and something showed up and extended its hand and said, "You want to come along with me?" And we didn't know, but we said yes. And everything happened after that. And so here you're talking about Mr. Kennedy, a fellow who you wanted to be like. He taught you in such a way that you wanted to take everything that he taught you and turn around and share it with someone else. So there was a connection there. There was a relationship there. There was an actual engagement there, whether you knew it at the time or not. And from what you're saying, you didn't necessarily get it at the time, nor would you have. But looking back, as we do, so that we can understand our lives, you're putting two and two together and saying, aha, this set me on the course, on the path of what I'm doing, for whom I'm doing it, how come I'm doing it. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. That's it.
That's the point about story, that whether we are natural storytellers or we have to practice a little bit around story, we are all still communicating in a language that we intuitively understand. And the minute someone says, "Once upon a time," or "Come with me to this place," or "I want to show you something special to me," or whatever the opening is going to be, even if it's just once, our brain is kind of set up to anticipate a story that's going to happen next. And that's why it works in this world. That's why when somebody trying to sell a set of steak knives says, "I'm going to tell you a story," we know, nah, you're not. You're trying to disguise an anecdote as a story and sell me a set of steak knives, and I'm calling your number on this because it ain't a story. It ain't a story. Here's a story. Something was, something happened, something is. If your listeners can put those three little bits down and come up with a story, they've got it. Something was. This is where I was. Something happened. Mr. Kennedy entered my life. Something is. I headed off to college, met another Mr. Kennedy, and doors opened for me such that decades later I can look back and say, that was the path. That was the path.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that then is something that you've said to me before, is you've asked me, what's your origin story? And the origin story has nothing to do with your degrees, with your certifications, with your CV, your resume, and all of that. It really comes from a different place. Your origin story is from someplace else.
Yes. Yeah. Your origin story, as we've said, is what entitles you to carry the medicine. And in your case, you're carrying the medicine of advocacy for environmental educators working independently, so you can show them, as well as others who would work with them, how they are different, how they are distinguished, how they are integral to communities. So to carry the medicine means that you've earned it in some way. And yes, you're right. Your credentials, your CV, etc., the things that you hang on the wall, they are evidence of how you have helped yourself add to your origin story. But your origin story is actually what defines you. It's what you were saying about how you were in high school listening to a Mr. Kennedy, and there you go. Do we have one origin story? We probably have many. But in this particular case, given these circumstances, given this topic, this is going to be your origin story. So, is this a good time to go into that?
Yes.
Good. So we know that if you take story and reduce it to its simplest components, something was, something happened, something is. Okay, great. we can work with that. So now we start with the first step, which is going to be your backstory. And that's just like saying, I was living in an ordinary world. Life was just happening. I was going along, da 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 da. You mentioned some of that when before you got to Mr. Kennedy, when you said that you were in high school, you were taking this class, then this other class came up, and you were sharing with us some details of yourself as a high school student, that you knew this, you knew that, you knew where you wanted to go, but when it came to plants, blech. I mean, it's no interest in that whatsoever. So what you're beginning to tell us is, okay, at that moment in time, I was a normal high school student. I thought I had an idea of where I was going to go. And when someone brought up this other idea, I had no interest in it and I wasn't going to pursue it. Okay. So it's just showing us some truth, some truthful details to who you were. Okay, that's step number one. We're just figuring out where you were at the time. The next step is that defining moment, that decision that says, okay, something happened in life, turned it upside down, and life is moving us away from what we were doing, what we thought we were going to be doing. And it moved us into a new direction, new work, new path. And in your story, that's what you said. You had this idea of where you were going to go, to what you were going to do in college, and the interactions with your high school teacher, Mr. Kennedy, set you off on a new path. And while you were in college, you met another Mr. Kennedy who introduced you to another field of study. And then you said, this is it. I've arrived. This story now that we're telling is always in service to our listener, to our audience, to help inspire them, to help them take some sort of action. And one of the questions, as we're framing our story, is to ask, okay, who's going to be listening to this? Who's the audience I'm going to be addressing? What do I want them to take away? And so in this particular case, what might be, so as in this particular case, if you were telling this story, what might be the audience that you would be talking to, and what action might you want to be inspiring them to take?
I would be sharing this story with my current audience, but also younger professionals, people who are looking to describe or figure out what's next for them, where they came from. I think it's very powerful to realize that your origin story comes from a very different place than where society, your degrees or whatever, all those landmark events, it doesn't come from there. Those are, as you said, those are just signs or kind of evidence of things completed.
Well, how you followed the path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and I would also, and I do this. I share with young people when I am in conversation about this type of a topic, is that, they can change their mind anytime that they want, right? and sometimes adults will wonder, well, they spent so many years doing this in school, why aren't they working in that field? Well, and then I say, well, it's because 4, 5, 6 years later, they are different people. That's not where they're at anymore. They finished the task, but that's not who they are.
Yeah, they've evolved like something in the natural world. They've grown. Their shape has shifted a little bit. Their interests have morphed into something else. Everything is, forward evolution. So yes, the idea that we're going to stay in something 30 years, 40 years and get a gold watch, that ain't happening anymore. There's no more gold watches. And people are much freer to say, I'm going to do this for a while, I'm going to do that for a while, and I'm going to do the next thing for a while because I have that opportunity, I have skills, I have education. And so at each of these turns in the road, perhaps your origin story is going to be changing. So when you said you're sharing this defining moment, your decision, the Mr. Kennedy story with people in the hopes of inspiring them that you can start out one place and end up another, will also be having effects in the audience in ways that you might not be expecting, where people are thinking back to a coach, a teacher, a religious person who inspired them in a way that at the time they were not really aware of. And so that's always good. And for those who have inspired others and know about it, it's nice to hear that again, that we were responsible for in some way helping guide someone onto a particular adventure in their life. So all the way around, we're still remembering that the involvement in a story has to do with emotions and feelings and memories and experiences. Some that you share, some that your listener is creating on their own because of what you shared.
The part about the listener creating their own story, that's the part that I know I forget all the time. That they are listening but also relating at the same time to their own experiences. You tend to forget that when you're busy leading a program, doing this, that, or the other. You tend to forget really that part of it. And I think that's a really good thing to remember, because that needs space on its own, all on its own,
It's a good point. And for people who haven't told story much or are looking to ramp up their origin story and get that dialed in a little bit better so that they're delivering it well. I remember as an early storyteller looking out at a group of people and seeing some faces that were pretty flat and thinking, okay, that's it. I'm done. Get the hook and pull me off the stage. And while that might have been true in some cases, what I learned was that when someone is listening to a story, when they are connected to the story, engaged with the story, relating with the teller of the story, they will hear something, a moment, a word, a phrase, an image, and it's almost as if they leave the story figuratively. They just kind of rock out of the story and they recall whatever that emotion, feeling, memory was. And then they come back in again. They haven't lost the story. It's a way of being. And the best way that I've always been able to describe it is that our listeners rock in and rock out of the story as different feelings, emotions, sensations wash over them. And so the face that you see that might have a flat affect on it or not very much expression could very easily be the type of person you're describing who is so deeply involved. They're really focused on it. They might be expressing that in a way that doesn't necessarily look like a smile or a frown or some other emotion. They're just deeply into that story. And that's a very precious place for a teller to be, to know that you're having that effect on an audience where you're sharing something that has happened to you in an effort to inspire, educate, illuminate, motivate.
Good points about that blank stare, that blank look.
That's
because
exactly
that can really throw you off course.
Mm-hmm. It can.
The same could be said for virtual conversations too, because you can see a lot of blank faces on a screen, on a video call. And that is very distracting. But maybe you shouldn't go there first. You should assume that they are really listening and reflecting, and then maybe afterward find out if that was true. Instead of sabotaging yourself and shutting yourself down.
Up. No. That's a good place to remind yourself. And see, the thing with these virtual Zoom whatevers, we are, 2 feet away from somebody's face on the screen? That doesn't happen in the real world. I mean, when you're at a campfire or you're speaking in a community venue or you're at some other event, you're not nose to nose with the people that you're speaking to. I mean, here in the West, we have a 3-foot rule. So somehow we manage to find out whatever 3 feet is. And, then we're 3 feet apart. And then, of course, with COVID, we've got 6 feet, 10 feet, whatever. So to have someone in our face with Zoom, almost literally, is unusual, it's unfamiliar, and it's weird. And so if you are in that place and you're telling a story and you're not seeing the reactions that you think you should be getting, let it go. Don't sabotage yourself with that thought that you're not getting across. Yeah, no, it's there. It's really there. Yeah. The other thing I'll throw in too about sabotaging yourself is, what if I forget? What if I forget a key point in my story? And I will say this, that while it might happen, oftentimes what does happen is you're kind of split. You're telling the story, and then there's this other you kind of over on the side that is hearing you tell the story. And if you get to a place where you forget something, that other side, see, you're saying, yes, you know this. This other side goes, oh, wait a minute, you forgot this. And so you circle back and say, but what I didn't tell you, or something that you need to hear about, and you insert that bit in there again. So to have no fear that you'll forget something in the story that you want to share with people.
Yeah, all good points. Okay, let's go on to
the next step. Okay, so along the way in your Mr. Kennedy story, I'm sure that you came up with challenges. And key to every story is challenge. If you don't have a challenge, you don't have a story, because that's what the story is all about. It's all about the transformation. It's all about beating back the enemies. It's all about how did you struggle through. It's all about how did you manage to make these challenges go away? How did you manage to overcome them? How did you get through the fire? I had a wonderful story mentor, Elizabeth Ellis, who always used to say, pick them up and slam them down. And it has to be that way. I mean, think about every story or movie. You're getting to the very edge. Oh my God, what's going to happen? And then boom. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen? And then boom. So to have that sense of the story. In fact, let's go back to the Mr. Kennedy story. Here you are in college. Someone introduces you to a field of study that you hadn't considered, and you went with that. But then it wasn't all easy peasy. What happened?
It wasn't all easy peasy. What happened? I just got involved in a different type of communication. I think making the classroom visits, being the traveling naturalist, helped. Yeah, what happened? Yeah, I started biology thinking I was going the physiology route, and it was that first biology class with the instructor, and yeah, I took that one. And that one was the first one that happened, and that I just changed course abruptly, right there. Mm-hmm. Not that I. But yeah, it was abrupt. I went in and then made a hard turn, I guess.
And then there were other opportunities that you pursued, but you were finding out that they weren't as rewarding or fulfilling to you as you first thought. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Now, and then when I transferred from my community college to the Cal State, I did take hematology and all that type of stuff. Also very interesting. But I think at that stage, I knew I had moved far enough away from that line of study that wasn't quite the fit for me.
And these are big choices because we're taught that when we choose a line of study or we go to college, then that should be it. We go forward from freshman to senior and we graduate and we get our degree and we go on to our job. And these things don't happen as smoothly as we're led to believe. There are challenges. And so for someone to make a pivot as they're going through is a big deal. Finding another school, finding another line of study, trying that on, seeing if that works. Is that going to go somewhere? Did they spend money, that they shouldn't have? It's a lot of big decisions that are driving that. So to have these challenges that we can speak to and say, this came up, I wasn't prepared for it, this is how I dealt with it. The next thing came up, it's like whack-a-mole, I wasn't prepared for it, this is how I dealt with it. So that we get to the point where there's finally a result that has changed us, both internally and externally. Externally in the sense that we can say there's a diploma on the wall that we really earned and we're proud of it, or how we go about our work in the community. But internally, we have changed in ways that we weren't prepared for. We might be stronger, more resilient, more courageous, more determined. We will know that. And perhaps people that are close to us will be able to see that internal change as well. And this is important to relate to the listeners in a way that says, this is how the challenges were overcome, not how way cool am I, and that might come through. But the sense of, I know what it's like to go through the rigors of life, just like you do. And here is how I did it. And you might do it differently. But we both know that life is, it's a pick them up and slam them down. Pick them up and slam them down. And so that would be a way of sharing. When we're doing this, so we're in the fourth step of the origin story, someone will probably want to know, well, how do I choose the challenges? Because I've got a bazillion of them. Well, find the one that you believe your audience is going to want to hear about because of what it is that you're going to be asking them. So if you were, as you said earlier, talking to young environmental educators and sharing the story about the path that you went, that it wasn't a direct from A to B, it wound around and up and down until you finally landed at where you are. Ask yourself, what might they want to feel at the end of this? What perhaps do they want to take away? What do I want them to take away? How does this particular challenge that I'm prepared to tell them, how does that relate to them in the context of the story that I'm sharing with them? So we have choices here. It doesn't have to be one thing that says we pick this place, we pick this challenge, we come out with this result. No, you can have multiple stories or versions of the story. But always we're going back to the origin story is in service to the listener. What do you want them to come away with, to enjoy, to remember? And how do you want them to act? How do you want them to act as a result?
Yes, and that also speaks to reflecting and being true to yourself all along the way, and being very observant about the choices that you make, why you're doing it, what the motivation is. Are you really doing what what you want to do, serving the people you want to serve, or are you getting pulled into the regular structure, system, status quo? And so I think if people knew what their origin stories were, I would think or hope that they would stay then on a truer path for themselves and a truer path for their audience, be able to serve their audience the way that they want to serve them.
Yes, it's a guide for them. One way of looking at this authenticity, this truth, is to ask, what is it? What is it that I can talk about all day long? What transformation did I undergo? And I can talk the leg off a chair about it. And so you've heard me talk often about the Camino.
Diane is referring to the Camino de Santiago, a 500-mile pilgrimage on a trail that's been in existence since the 9th century. Learn more in the show notes.
And so my life is BC and AC, before the Camino and after the Camino. And I can talk the legs off chairs and tables and everything else. I can talk about it all day long because I recognize that it was something that came into my life when I didn't expect it. It was a call to go out, and I followed it. And there were challenges aplenty. And the thought that I wasn't going to complete it, I wasn't even going to get off the plane. I was just going to turn around and go back home again. But that whole adventure has reshaped my life so that I look at, what am I doing? Who am I doing it for? How come? And so these origin stories can get us back on track when we're being distracted by shiny things or what somebody else is doing or how many likes someone is getting on Facebook or LinkedIn. It brings us back. It grounds us. Again, it says, this is who you are at the heart of you. This is where you originated from to give you the right to do the work that you're doing. Will it always be that way? Probably not. We go on, as you said earlier, to different things. And so one way to begin this process is actually at the end. I like this phrase of walking the cat back. I hadn't heard that before. And it actually means that you walk the cat all the way back to the beginning of something. You're at the end, walk it back to the beginning of something and find out, how did this thing unfold? But in order to have a cat, you have to have the end. So a way to begin with this is to start at the end. What's your transformation? What are you wanting to share with the world? What are you inviting people to do along with you? Get involved. How? Start there and then walk it back to the beginning and say, how did I get the right? How did I earn the medicine that I'm carrying out into the world? And then some of these other steps about the life that you were living, the defining moment and the decision, the challenges will kind of fall into place a little bit better. And they will show you how you actualized your goal, what visions you might have forgotten you had. And you can say, oh, wow, as you did, Tania. Oh, I remember this. I remember that. I remember this person. I remember this turn in the road. And when it lights you up, then you know. Then you know you're sharing that story, the one that really matters, because we were not put on this earth to be quiet. We came here with a voice, and we came here with a voice for a purpose. And whether it's our heard voice as our spoken voice, or it's our written voice, or it's our performing voice, or it's whatever, we came here with a voice to be heard, to say whatever the truth is of what we want to convey. And so the place we begin that is the origin story that says, I know because I've lived this and I want to share this with you. So as you said, earlier with Mr. Kennedy, you wanted to turn around and share with everybody else what he taught you. And that's a very good clue that you're on the right way.
Thank you, Diane, for teaching us about story and for walking us through this process and introducing ourselves to ourselves, really, by talking about our origin story. And listeners, if you are interested in exploring your own origin story, Diane and I are working on a workshop to help you do exactly that.
That's going to be a lot of fun because we just get to take this and expand upon it and have a chance to work together again. And so I can be fangirl about that. And I loved what you said about introducing ourselves to ourselves. That's a keeper.
We hope you've enjoyed learning about story and are inspired to reflect on your own origin story. To learn more about Diane, Engaged Storyism, Diane's podcast, Stories from Women Who Walk, as well as the Camino de Santiago, see the show notes for this episode. To receive information about the storytelling workshop, please add your name to the mailing list. The link to do this is in the show notes too. See you next time.